So this session is dealing with your data. So essentially it is data management. And as you all know, data management is key to conducting qualitative research and any kind of research, because if you don't manage your data, you're going to land up with a situation which is unmanageable to you and you might not get your work done. And we apologize for the noise. Am I being quiet? Okay. So the learning objectives for this session, you should know the importance of a data management process, and this is something that you should know already as experienced researchers and having started this. And I've also highlighted some steps and issues involved in managing your data. So why do we do data management? We do data management and we make sure we know where everything is to help analysis, because often in analysis we go backwards and forwards between different cases. So we need to know where those are. We also, like we discussed in the earlier sessions, we are accountable to stakeholders. If they ask us a question, we need to find why we did something, where the information is, and we need to be able to show our analysis process. It also extends the life of data. So sometimes, and more recently, it's common to do secondary analysis on existing data, or we might, not supplication, but supplementation of research. So we supplement existing data with further interviews, for example. So it might be that other researchers ask for your data. And there are, of course, also rules for the storage of data. We discussed earlier that KI, we need to save data for 10 years and so on, and important project documentation. I did a search on the internet for the guidelines and rules, but I actually couldn't find it. So it's probably something that is on a need to know basis. But I have a link to where the guidelines are, so I will send those to the KI participants and others if they're interested. And finally, managing your data well and making sure you know what you have is really, it's a time-saving thing. Because this is a familiar picture to me. This is what I look like. I have a prettier cell phone, or a prettier phone than that. But this is usually what we look like in the middle of a data collection process. This is not uncommon to any of us. And the aim of this lecture is really to try and help you do things in a way that you won't end up with piles of paper and informed consent forms all over the show and so on. So dealing with your data, you obviously go through a process. First, you collect your data. You might have focus groups, interviews, documents, anything like that. You also have your informed consent forms. And you need to decide what needs to be done to this data. Will you transcribe it? Will you translate it? What formats will you store it? And you need to organize a filing and storage system for it. And now I'd like to open for some discussion and answers. Have you done data management before, or any kind of experience of doing qualitative research, and what challenges did you experience? And what would you do differently if you started a new study? And I'd like you to talk instead of using a discussion board at this point.
Well, I've used for analyzing my data, I used NVivo, but that's also a very powerful tool to organize and manage the data. But you can also sort of use scanned documents and so on. So I found it very helpful. Since you have a lot of interviews, maybe you have both audio and transcript, and you want to sort of compare to take you back what was said in the interview, and it was really helpful. That's one way.
Yeah. I think they do have the analysis softwares do have that advantage, so that they can store your data in one place and it's easy to find when you're doing the analysis. I think it's probably something that I haven't included in this presentation though, but it's a good point.
Well, I agree. I had similar experiences with the data that I didn't have maybe that much of the data, but like exporting in vivo and organizing it in a whatever in vivo lets you do with the data because there are many ways of doing it in the some people still um, do the coloring and cutting and pasting, and there's one way of doing it, but this my first experience with analyzing qualitative data was with in vivo and um, like referencing, quoting, and organizing in that the way that Vivo does, it actually helps you to make some sense of it.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. It's Ulrika here. I can't actually hear the comments. I think because you're too far away from the microphone, so I can just kind of hear mumbling.
Oh,
So I
okay.
don't know if it's possible to speak louder or to move the microphone closer to the people who make comments.
I tried to move it, but it clearly
Okay.
wasn't close enough. But the
Right.
discussion was around in vivo and using an software, an analysis software to organize your data and being able to make put quotes and link things to each other when you have different interviews and different sources, and being able to have the audio
Yeah.
formats as well as the written formats together. But we'll try to shout, all of us.
Thanks.
Yeah, Ulrika, do you have anything to share about this? Any experiences?
Well, I'm trying to think of good examples. I think it's uh, um, it's really a good idea to be very organized from the start. I've also used NVivo, and kind of where you can store the audio files and things, and I thought that worked quite well, but I'm not sure I used the full potential of that program. Um, I've also had problems when I did my first study when I got interviews from different countries. I did interviews in one country, and then other people did interviews in two other countries, and then part of my where I had to transcribe the interviews myself, but only transcribe part of it and so on. So, and transcription just takes such a long time. So
Yeah,
my feeling is that if possible, you should get somebody who's very good at transcribing and can do it much quicker because it really takes a long time.
yeah. Okay. So that's something that I'll be discussing a little later as well. So that's actually the next slide then, is about transcription, and it's about who should transcribe, whether you use your interviewers, professional transcribers, or whether you have your own staff. And like Ulrika just said, 1 hour interview can take up to 8 hours of time to transcribe. And after you've done the interview and you're sitting down with your tape and you're going over and over and over it, it's incredibly boring and probably not the best use of your time. Obviously, the detail of transcription depends on the level of analysis you're going to do, and verbatim is preferred. But I would recommend, based on my experience, that you use somebody professional. You can, of course, hire your own staff, which has the advantage that you have somebody who is going to develop in this field and that can in future engage in research projects as well, if you have the funding for it. The professionals have the disadvantage that though they do it really quickly, they also cost quite a bit of money. But these are the kind of issues you have to balance your funding with your time, with, with just the potential that you have for doing this. There are examples of a transcription protocol.
Yeah,
Existing.
okay.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Transcription protocols really set out on how you agree that transcription will be done. So I could basically open this link, but I think one of the papers that I also put on Moodle last night had a good transcription protocol. So it's an agreement between you and a transcriber on what will be transcribed and importantly what won't be transcribed. No, wait, that was a translation, sorry. What will be transcribed, how it will be, to what detail. Will you have each and ah, and will you have each pause marked in a certain way? How you will record what kind of participants you had and the identity of our participants. And I think this link works. So I can basically show this to you. So this is just from a doc stock. It's general instructions on how the text should be formatted. Also very important when you're reading it. You can have the labels on what you're going to have, what kind of audio tape changes, or if you have some kind of changes in your recording these days, you have those digital recorders, so you don't really change tapes that often. Documenting any kind of comments and noting about the end of interview and inaudible information, overlapping speech, how it's marked, pauses, how they're marked. All of this is really important. I can tell you, for example, an example from my studies where I had a transcriber who was not a professional transcriber do transcription for my study. And I had to verify these transcriptions, obviously, so that I would know that what was discussed in the focus group would end up in my data, because it's also the danger that you hire somebody to do something and transcription is boring work, so they don't do it properly. And in this case, she had, I didn't have a protocol, and she had made up her own rules on what she should transcribe and what she shouldn't. So there was a huge load of data in the beginning that was informal conversation and wasn't related to the questions that was asked, and she decided to leave it out. So I had to ask her to do it all over again, and it was really time consuming and created a lot of trouble in, trying to verify that all the information discussed in the group that was actually relevant to the research was included in a transcription. So I would recommend using those if you're using transcribers. Translation in most settings is also an issue. If you don't speak the language where you're doing the interviews, or if your supervisors don't speak the language that you speak and you're doing the interviews in, and you need to do some kind of independent data analysis. So that is also something to think about. The challenges with this are, of course, costs. Translating something costs a lot of money. And the quality of translation, depending on who you hire or who you use, may vary. And it's also a time-consuming process. But the benefits of translating your data is that you can disseminate your data. Obviously, if you're going to publish the data, you're going to have to translate it at some point. And in multi-site studies, you will be able to work across the sites and people will be able to understand what's going on. Here again, you need to consider who will do it. Will it be a professional translator? Will it be a semi-professional person, somebody you hire? Will you do it yourself? And how will you verify and establish quality and validity? Will you do back translation, which means that you will translate the entire thing again? Will you have somebody check it? Is something omitted, like what happened to me? Is it distorted? And of course, there's logistical challenges. You need to make sure that you have the transcript and it's set so that we have it translated correctly. Will you translate this directly from audio, or whether you will do it from the paper version? The language challenges are also quite prevalent in translation. For example, translators often have the wish to clean up language. There might be some words that are not socially acceptable, so they put prettier words for that. Or they might translate the literal meaning. So you might lose some of the meaning of what was discussed in your translation. I've had a situation where I had a questionnaire translator. It's not necessarily related to qualitative research, but I was working in the community in South Africa, and I had the university translate the questionnaire, and the language that the university used was not appropriate for the community. So the community members complained that, no, this is high Xhosa, I'm not going to understand this. People don't understand this. I don't want to use this. So we had to redo it in a group and check the translation over again. And for the language challenges and cleaning up language, it's important to have a do not translate list. So those might be those kind of words that you don't want translated, that's kind of understandable in different contexts. I can't think of any examples. Maybe you have some examples of words that might be important. No. You say, for example, a word like bokkie, which would be in Afrikaans, it could refer to a small deer, as in a deer with horns, or it could refer to somebody who is a very dear person to you. So that might be something that you don't want translated because you want to keep the meaning of an endearing term. And you don't want it necessarily translated into English. That's a very silly example, but it might help. Another issue to think about is confidentiality in transcription and translation. And you need to think about what information your interviews consist of. How sensitive is that information? How many names are mentioned? And what does it mean to ensure confidentiality and anonymity in translation and transcription? And Karolinska Institute is expanding, as you can hear. Yes, they're expanding through the roof. So you need to think about, you're going to have maybe an external person who's going to access your data. There might be issues of confidentiality there. How will you ensure that they won't discuss the data and so on? Usually you would expect that there's some kind of professional integrity involved, but you need to keep that in mind, that those might be also issues to encounter. And then we get to the filing, knowing what you have. Good data management implies that you know what you have collected. So you need to keep a record of how many interviews or focus group discussions or other data categories you have. You need to include dates on which data collection took place. It would be really useful to have a Excel sheet, for example, where you know this interview is either being transcribed, in process, not yet sent, where it is in the process, and how much you've managed and how much you've got left to do. You need to know the location of your informed consent forms. They need to be secure, and you need to know how many you have. And of course, you need to have some kind of idea of where your electronic and paper-based data is stored. These ethical rules would usually say that paper-based data would be in a locked room. Your electronic should be password protected, so it means that you can't have it on various flash drives and computers and so on, which you're likely to have as you're working through it. In terms of the size of your study, you might also consider having standard operating procedures if you have a team collecting data. So if you have standard operating procedures that person A goes to a particular site and collects this data, brings it to another person who logs it in this way, then each team member would know their job and each stage of data collection would be recorded somewhere. So it would be easier for you to find it. And there's no reason why you shouldn't do that for single persons conducting studies. Right. So, as I've tried to hint, your files should be stored in one place and they should be securely protected. Your file name should be descriptive enough for you to be able to locate it easily, and your file should have a data collection and transcription if that's applicable. And I'm not recommending things like jenny1.doc or stakeholder tb january13.doc. That's the kind of file names that I use. But if anybody else is ever going to access your data, they're not going to be able to say, they're not going to be able to find it. So again, importance of confidentiality and anonymity. All of your data should be anonymized, and the data should be stored separately from the identifying information. And the data should be stored securely, password protected files and protected servers and locked rooms and so on. I think Mira and I discussed yesterday on how you actually do it in practice to anonymize the data and how you have your codes in a separate document. Something that's useful is having headers and footers in your documents if you have documents. You can include pseudonyms, places and dates, or key demographic data, but some identifiers necessary to enable cross-case comparison because you want to know who you're dealing with. And the type of identifier depends, of course, on the data that you use. So your recordings, you have different types of recordings. You have analog recordings, digital recordings, which are not very common, and there are different rules depending on the country in which you are in on whether to not to destroy them at the end of research. I think South Africa requires that you destroy your recordings after they are transcribed and translated, whereas other settings would say that it's important to keep them because you might have to refer to them later. So you need to know your guidelines for the setting in which you're doing your research, and then also consider storage options for that. And the last word on this very quick session that is backup, backup, and backup, and backup again. And really do it and not just intend to do it. As I said before, I'm very unlucky with computers and cars, and I've learned that you need to back up, and I'm still not doing it properly, but you really do need to do that. And an important thing about data management is you need to allow time for the data collection and management process, because if you have too little time and you're rushing around, it ends up in data chaos. And when you're writing your protocol, you need to think through data management issues. There's a couple of papers on qualitative interviews, on data preparation and transcription, and on translation as an issue of methods that I put in Moodle, and I recommend that you go to them and read them. Are there any questions or comments on this? This was, again, a very short, super short lecture. Anyone over here? Self-explanatory, obvious.
I was wondering about like
Oh, hold on. No, wait, that's Linda. Yeah, no, it's her background noise.
oh okay. So I was wondering like this translation issue something that some translation issues it's very laborious and costly process. So like how would qualitative research feel about using this automated translation aid or like software? So I know that they're not the best quality of translations, but would it be some way to help?
I think it could be used as an aid, but I think given the quality of those, I think you'd probably have to go over it again and make sure that the translation software is not making mistakes, because you do need to know what the data actually says. I know for some languages, for example, the example of Finnish, if you use some kind of software, it makes it completely ridiculous. Wananga wanted to know what the question was, and the question was, can you use translation software in qualitative research to help you do the translation? Does that answer your question? So I would say that you can use them, but I think you need to be very clear on how you're going to make sure that it actually reflects what's being talked about.
Okay, and I also heard about the advantages of using external or professional people to transcribe or translate. But this is also something I'm wondering about like other due to time limitation, of course. But there are obvious disadvantages of doing that. Like for instance, listening to your own data tape recorded would actually make like my fear is that like there are a lot of the content will be just misinterpreted. So I would be more confident like going and still listening to it, and so I don't know, like there is a trade-off, and I don't know which is the best.
Okay, so Mira was raising an issue about transcription, about the fear of losing the data and the context and the meaning of the data when using professional transcribers. And I would say to that using professional transcribers is useful, but it's also useful to listen to your data again. So what I've done and what I would continue doing is that I would use somebody to transcribe the data, and then after that I would check the transcription myself. So I would read, and you have to do that anyway. So for example, my transcriber was a person that I used and I worked with very closely, but he would make sure that when he didn't hear a word, he would put a row of stars on the word that he didn't hear. And that meant that I still had to go through the data. And the point is kind of like he was an extremely good transcriber. He was very experienced. He did it professionally. But still, sometimes he heard it wrong. I mean, you can always hear it wrong. So you do need to check it when you go back.
I was thinking if you do it in another language, there's all sort of cultural aspects that you can't pick up in just translation, sarcasm or double meaning or all that. How do you handle this? I mean, you're dependent on the translator too.
So yeah.
But she or her or him are probably well, they're also culture bearers in their own context. I mean, how do you bridge
those? So I don't know if everybody heard that question, but that was about the translation process and how you have some kind of cultural barriers in the translation, and how you handle issues like sarcasm that might not come across the translation. One way of handling that would be involving your translators in the research. That's been done as well, and that's actually recommended. Sometimes the challenge is if you use a semi-professional person that you've hired to do the translation, they might not be prepared or interested in participating in the analysis. But it's really useful to keep a close relationship with the translator and discuss with them, and you can even take your data to them and show them and say, this is what I came up with. Would this, in your opinion, reflect? So it's a kind of a member check with them if they're prepared to do that. Sometimes they're not, especially professional. Linda asked, how does one maintain verbatim quotes while also being mindful of the quality of English? Does it have to be verbatim, or is there a way of working around it? And I would say that if you are publishing your paper, then they usually have those, you have to have good quality English. It needs to be properly spelled. There's a way of putting your verbatim quote and putting it in the way that it's said, and then you put in brackets sick, which means that you acknowledge that there are some mistakes in grammar or spelling, but you are including it exactly as it was said. So it's not usually recommended that you prettify the language into something that would be grammatically correct, because you might also lose meaning while you're doing that. Are there any other questions? Are there questions from China, or you see Wenang was online?
Yeah, how to keep the consistency and testify the consistency. Yes. If a research carried out in different country and these countries use different language, and how to keep the researchers consistency and justify the consistency.
Okay.
Collins.
So how to keep the consistency when a study is done in two different settings with two different languages? I think yes, okay, I got the question typed up as well. So I think the way to handle that is, first of all, the researchers that are involved and the translators that are involved They need to have some kind of standard operating procedure so that they do the data collection in the same way. And then you also need to discuss within your research group on, what are the things that shouldn't be translated, and what are the meanings, or what kind of translation should you be performing. And perhaps you could also then involve the translators in the process and have them discuss with you on how the analysis is done. But I would say that it just requires a lot of detailed discussion on how to conduct it and how to translate it. You can't guarantee that it will be exactly the same, and you need to acknowledge that it won't be exactly the same in a different setting. And you need to take that into account in your analysis as well. Does that answer your question? Okay, there was a nod.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if there are no other questions, then yep. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.